in the agricultural heartlands of the Frankish territories, where the rhythm of seasons governed all life and ancient wisdom passed from generation to generation. A farmer named Godric tended his family's strips of land with the same steady attention his father and grandfather had shown before him. The year was 873, and autumn had begun its slow transformation of the countryside. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will carry us to the Frankish farmlands in the year 873, where we will follow Godric through the quiet rhythms of his work with the land. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. Godric was 41 years old, with earth-stained hands and sun-weathered skin that spoke of decades spent beneath open skies. His movements carried the unhurried patience of someone who understood that the land rewarded steady attention rather than haste, and he approached each task with the same thorough care he had learned as a boy working alongside his father in these very fields. The morning had arrived cool and gray, with mist clinging to the valley floor and obscuring the distant tree line. Godric stepped from his family's timber dwelling into air that smelled of damp earth and wood smoke from neighboring hearths. He paused for a moment, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dim light, listening to the muted sounds of the village stirring to life around him. His wife had set out a wooden bowl containing porridge made from barley, still warm from the cooking fire. Godric ate slowly, savoring the simple nourishment, while his thoughts drifted to the work awaiting him in the fields. The three-field system that organized their agricultural life had become as familiar to him as the changing seasons themselves, each rotation bringing its own particular tasks and considerations. When the meal was finished, he gathered the tools he would need. His wooden-handled hoe rested against the wall where he had left it the previous evening, its blade worn smooth from years of use. The weight of it in his hands brought a sense of readiness, of connection to the work that had sustained his family through countless seasons. The walk to the fields took him along a path beaten hard by generations of footsteps. Other villagers were already making their way toward their own strips of land, moving with the same measured pace that characterized the beginning of each workday. Greetings were exchanged in quiet voices, simple acknowledgments that required no elaborate conversation. Godric's family held several narrow strips scattered across the three great fields that surrounded the village. This distribution had developed over many generations, ensuring that each household received a fair share of both the better soil near the stream and the heavier clay that dominated the higher ground. The system brought a sense of equity to their community, a shared understanding that all would prosper or struggle together. The first field he approached lay fallow this season, resting after bearing its crop of winter wheat the previous year. The earth here had been turned several times over the summer months, allowing the soil to recover its strength. Weeds had been pulled as they appeared, preventing them from stealing the nourishment the land needed to restore itself. Now, in early autumn, the field showed the results of this careful attention, soil that crumbled easily in the hand, dark and rich with the promise of future abundance. Godric made his way along the edge of his fallow strip, examining the ground with an experienced eye. He knelt occasionally to crumble soil between his fingers, testing its texture and moisture. The earth felt cool against his skin, holding just enough dampness from recent rains without being waterlogged. His movements were unhurried as he worked his way down the length of the strip, nodding where the ground might benefit from additional turning before winter arrived. The second field, visible across the gentle rise of land, had produced a harvest of spring barley earlier in the season. The stubble still stood in neat rows, golden brown stalks that rustled softly when the breeze moved through them. Godric had already spent several days cutting and bundling that grain, work that had occupied much of late summer. Now those bundles rested safely in the village granary, measured and recorded according to the portion owed to their lord, and the amount his family would keep for their own needs. By mid-morning, the mist had begun to lift, revealing a sky of uniform gray that promised neither rain nor sunshine. The temperature remained cool but comfortable, ideal for the physical work of farming. Godric shifted his attention to the third field, where winter rye had been sown weeks earlier. Tiny green shoots had emerged in orderly rows, following the furrows he had carved with the community's shared wooden plow and the patient strength of the oxen. He walked between the rows, his earth-stained hands clasped behind his back, observing the early growth with quiet satisfaction. The seeds had taken well, their emergence timed perfectly with the gradually cooling weather. The young plants would continue their growth through autumn, establishing strong roots before winter's coldness sent them into dormancy. When spring returned, they would resume their growth, maturing through the warmer months until ready for harvest next summer. The three-field system had organized agricultural life in these territories for as long as anyone could remember. Each year brought its rotation. The field that had lain fallow would receive spring plantings. The field that had grown spring crops would be sown with winter grain, and the field that had produced winter harvest would rest. This pattern ensured that the soil never became exhausted, that each portion of earth received regular periods of recovery. Godric found deep contentment in this rhythm. The predictability brought security, a sense that the land would continue to provide as long as they maintained their careful attention to its needs. There was wisdom in the pattern, knowledge accumulated across generations and proven through countless cycles of planting and harvest. The afternoon arrived with gradual shifts in light rather than dramatic change. The gray sky brightened slightly, though the sun remained hidden behind the uniform clouds. Godric continued his inspection of the winter rye, occasionally pulling a stray weed that had established itself among the grain. His movements remained steady and thorough, never rushing, always attentive to the details that would influence the eventual harvest. When the rye field had been fully examined, he made his way to the common area where agricultural tools were stored. The wooden plow waited there, its iron-tipped blade cleaned and ready for the next use. Several other men from the village were already present, discussing the timing of autumn plowing in the fallow field. Their voices carried the same unhurried quality that characterized all aspects of village life, a recognition that decisions about the land benefited from careful consideration rather than hasty judgment. Godric joined the discussion naturally, adding his observations about the soil conditions in his fallow strips. The conversation flowed without urgency, each man contributing his thoughts while others listened with respectful attention. They spoke of when the ground would be ready for the final turning before winter, of which days might be set aside for the communal work, or how many oxen would be needed for the task. These decisions were made collectively, reflecting the shared nature of agricultural life. The heavy plow required multiple oxen to pull, more animals than any single household possessed. The work of plowing therefore became a community effort, with families contributing their oxen and their labor in an arrangement that had evolved over many generations. Each household benefited from the strength of the community, just as the community relied on each household fulfilling its obligations. The discussion concluded as the light began its slow fade toward evening. The men dispersed gradually, each returning to his own dwelling at his own pace. Godric walked back along the familiar path, his sun-weathered skin cool in the afternoon air, his thoughts settled and peaceful. His wife was preparing the evening meal when he arrived, the scent of pottage filling their timber dwelling with warmth and comfort. Godric settled onto the wooden bench near the hearth, allowing the day's exertions to ease from his muscles. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the earthen floor and rough wooden walls. They ate together in companionable silence, the thick vegetable pottage providing nourishment after the day's work. When the meal was complete, Godric remained by the fire, watching the flames shift and flicker. His mind drifted over the fields he had examined that day, reviewing what he had observed, considering what the coming weeks would bring. The three-field system organized not just the physical layout of the land but the entire calendar of village life. Each season brought its prescribed tasks: spring plowing and planting, summer growing and weeding, autumn harvest and preparation, winter rest and maintenance. This pattern provided structure to their days, a framework that connected them to the land and to each other. Godric reflected on how this system had sustained his family through the years. His father had worked these same strips of land, had followed the same rotation, and had participated in the same communal decisions about timing and technique. Now Godric carried forward that accumulated knowledge, adding his own observations and insights to the collective wisdom of the village. The fire had burned low by the time he finally sought his rest. He stretched out on the sleeping platform, the straw-filled mattress familiar beneath him. Through the small gaps in the wooden walls, he could hear the sounds of the village settling into night, distant voices, the movement of animals in their pens, the occasional bark of a dog. His thoughts returned once more to the fields, to the rotation that would bring new plantings and new harvests in the seasons ahead. The pattern held a beauty in its simplicity, a recognition that the land needed both use and rest, that human needs and the earth's capacity could be balanced through careful attention and patient stewardship. Sleep arrived gradually, like mist settling over the valley floor, bringing with it dreams of green shoots pushing through dark soil, of golden grain swaying in summer breezes, of the eternal cycle of planting and harvest that connected him to the land and to all those who had worked it before. The following morning arrived with clearer skies, the clouds having dissipated during the night to reveal pale autumn sunlight. Godric rose with the first hints of dawn, his body accustomed to waking with the natural rhythms of light and season. The air inside the dwelling held the coolness of night, though the embers in the hearth still glowed faintly, awaiting fresh wood to coax them back to flame. His wife stirred the fire to life while Godric prepared for the day's work. He had decided to spend this morning attending to the fallow field, examining more closely the areas where the soil might benefit from additional preparation. The work would be solitary and meditative, the kind of task that allowed his mind to settle into the peaceful rhythm of repetitive motion. After breaking his fast with bread and ale, he gathered a wooden-handled spade and made his way toward the fields. The path was damp with dew, the grass along its edges bent under the weight of moisture. Overhead, a few birds moved through the brightening sky, their calls carrying across the quiet landscape. The fallow field stretched before him, its surface showing the results of the summer's careful tending. Godric began his work methodically, moving along his family's strips with the spade, turning soil that needed additional loosening. The blade sliced through earth with a familiar resistance, neither too hard nor too soft, just the proper texture that indicated healthy ground recovering its fertility. Each thrust of the spade brought up soil that crumbled pleasantly when disturbed. Godric worked steadily, lifting and turning, creating neat piles that would settle and weather through the coming winter months. The physical exertion warmed his muscles despite the cool air, and he found himself falling into the timeless meditation that such work always provided. The sun climbed higher as the morning progressed, its pale light gaining strength though never quite breaking through to full warmth. Godric paused occasionally to straighten his back, surveying the progress he had made. The turned earth showed darker where moisture had been exposed, creating a pattern across the field that marked his steady advance. Other villagers worked their own strips nearby, some turning soil as he was doing, others examining drainage channels or clearing stubborn weeds from field margins. The work proceeded in comfortable silence, each person absorbed in their own tasks while remaining aware of the shared purpose that united them. Occasionally, a greeting would pass between workers, a brief exchange that acknowledged companionship without interrupting the flow of labor. By the time the sun reached its highest point, Godric had completed the section he had intended to address. He set down his spade and walked to the edge of the field where a small stream provided clear water. Kneeling beside the flowing water, he cupped his earth-stained hands and drank deeply, the coolness refreshing after the morning's exertion. He remained there for a time, listening to the gentle movement of water over stones, watching the play of light on the surface. The stream marked one boundary of the village's agricultural lands, its reliable flow ensuring that crops never suffered from complete drought even in the driest summers. The water supported life in countless ways, drinking for people and animals, moisture for the fields, power for the mill downstream. When he felt sufficiently rested, Godric made his way toward the village center. The community maintained a common area where tools were stored and where villagers often gathered for brief conversations during the workday. Several men were already there when he arrived, discussing plans for the upcoming communal plowing. The conversation centered on practical matters, which days would work best for the majority of households, how to coordinate the use of the oxen, which sections of the fallow field should receive attention first. Godric contributed his thoughts based on his morning's work, noting which areas of his strips needed the plow's attention most urgently. These discussions always proceeded with careful deliberation. Decisions about agricultural timing affected everyone, and the community had learned through long experience that hasty choices often led to complications. Better to spend time in thorough consideration, ensuring that all voices were heard and all factors properly weighed. The meeting concluded naturally as the afternoon drew on. Godric departed with a clear understanding of when his family's oxen would be needed for the communal plowing, a schedule that accommodated the needs of all participating households. The arrangement satisfied him. It was fair, practical, and rooted in the mutual dependence that made their agricultural system function smoothly. He chose to spend the remaining daylight hours checking on the winter rye once more. The young plants continued their steady growth, their green shoots now slightly taller than they had been during his previous inspection. Godric walked slowly between the rows, observing with pleasure the uniformity of the planting. The furrows had been straight and properly spaced, the seeds distributed evenly, and the results showed in the orderly emergence of the crop. A light breeze moved through the field, stirring the young grain plants in gentle waves. The movement brought with it the scent of earth and growing things, that distinctive smell of life establishing itself in soil. Godric breathed deeply, finding satisfaction in this sensory confirmation of the field's health. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon when he finally turned his steps homeward. The light took on the golden quality peculiar to late afternoon, casting long shadows across the landscape and warming the colors of the autumn countryside. The air had cooled again, reminding him that winter approached steadily despite the occasional mild day. At his dwelling, his wife had begun preparations for the evening meal. Godric settled near the hearth, allowing the day's work to ease from his body. His muscles held that pleasant tiredness that came from productive physical labor, a feeling of having contributed meaningfully to the necessary tasks of survival and sustenance. They shared the evening meal as darkness gathered outside, the firelight creating a circle of warmth and comfort within their timber walls. The pottage was thick with barley and root vegetables from the household's small garden plot, nourishment that would sustain them through the evening and into the following day. After eating, Godric sat by the fire, his thoughts drifting over the patterns that organized their lives. The three-field system represented more than just an agricultural technique. It embodied a philosophy of balance and sustainability. By allowing one field to rest each year, they ensured that the soil could recover its strength. By rotating the types of crops planted, they prevented any single field from being depleted of particular nutrients. The wisdom of the system revealed itself through generations of successful harvests. He thought about how this rotation connected their small village to something larger. Other communities throughout the Frankish territories followed similar patterns, their fields organized according to the same principles, their agricultural calendars aligned with the same seasonal rhythms. This shared approach created a kind of unity across the landscape, thousands of farmers all participating in the same ancient dance with the land. The fire crackled softly, sending occasional sparks upward toward the smoke hole in the roof. Outside, the sounds of the village at night created a familiar backdrop: the lowing of cattle in their pens, the distant bark of a dog, the murmur of voices from a neighboring dwelling. These sounds formed the texture of their existence, as reliable and comforting as the rotation of the fields themselves. Godric reflected on the year ahead, mentally reviewing the cycle that would unfold. The winter rye would continue growing through autumn, then rest during the cold months before resuming its growth in spring. The fallow field would receive its final preparations and then lie undisturbed through winter, gathering strength for the spring plantings. The field that had produced barley would be prepared for winter grain, continuing the rotation that ensured no section of earth was ever asked to give more than it could sustainably provide. This pattern had sustained his family for as long as memory reached back. His grandfather had worked these fields according to the same rotation, as had countless ancestors before him. The system connected him not just to the land, but to a long chain of human effort and accumulated wisdom. Each generation learned from the one before, adding small refinements while maintaining the essential framework that had proven its worth through centuries of use. The evening deepened into full night, the darkness outside completely save for the occasional glimmer of firelight from other dwellings. Godric remained by the hearth a while longer, savoring the warmth and the peaceful contemplation that always came to him at day's end. His sun-weathered skin had relaxed from the day's exposure to wind and light, his earth-stained hands resting comfortably in his lap. When he finally sought his rest, he carried with him a deep sense of contentment. The day had been productive, the work satisfying, the rhythm of agricultural life continuing its eternal pattern. He stretched out on the sleeping platform, the familiar comfort of straw and wool surrounding him. Sleep came easily, bringing dreams of fields in endless rotation, fallow earth dark and rich, spring plantings emerging in green rows, golden grain ready for harvest. The cycle turned through his sleeping mind like the seasons themselves, each phase flowing naturally into the next, the pattern eternal and reassuring in its reliability. The days that followed brought Godric back to the fields repeatedly, each morning presenting its own particular tasks within the larger framework of the agricultural calendar. The weather remained generally favorable, cool, but not cold, dry enough for work, but not so dry as to hinder the growth of the winter grain. The seasons were cooperating, providing the conditions that farmers hoped for during this transitional period between harvest and winter rest. One morning, Godric devoted his attention to examining the drainage channels that ran along the lower edges of the fields. These narrow ditches served the essential purpose of preventing waterlogging during the rainy seasons, ensuring that the roots of growing plants didn't become saturated and rot. Maintaining these channels required regular inspection and occasional clearing of debris that accumulated over time. He walked slowly along the length of the main channel, nodding where fallen leaves and small branches had created minor blockages. Using a wooden rake, he cleared these obstructions carefully, allowing the water to flow freely once more. The work was simple but necessary, one of the countless small tasks that together ensured the fields remained productive year after year. The sun emerged fully that day, breaking through the usual autumn overcast to bathe the landscape in clear light. The warmth felt pleasant on Godric's back as he worked, though the air retained enough coolness to prevent any true discomfort from exertion. Birds moved through the fields, searching for insects and seeds among the stubble and turned earth. When the drainage work was complete, Godric made his way to the section of the fallow field where he had been turning soil several days earlier. The earth he had worked had already begun to settle slightly, the piles relaxing into gentler mounds that would continue to weather and break down through the coming winter. The sight satisfied him. This soil would be perfectly prepared when spring planting time arrived. He knelt to examine the earth more closely, letting it sift through his fingers. The texture was ideal, neither too sandy nor too heavy with clay. The dark color spoke of good fertility, the result of allowing this field to rest after its previous year's production. Godric had seen throughout his life how this rotation maintained soil quality far better than continuous planting ever could. The afternoon brought a shift in the air, a subtle change that suggested weather arriving from the west. Clouds began gathering along the horizon, though they moved slowly and seemed unlikely to bring rain before evening. Godric continued his work at an unhurried pace, finishing the tasks he had set for himself without concern for the changing sky. As the light began to fade, he made his way to the common storage area where the community's agricultural tools were kept. Several other men had arrived there as well, their workday also drawing to a close. The conversation turned naturally to observations about the season's progress, how the winter rye was establishing itself, how the fallow fields were responding to their rest, what preparations still needed completion before true winter arrived. Godric listened as much as he spoke, valuing the collective knowledge that emerged from these informal gatherings. Each farmer brought observations from his own strips of land, and together these individual insights formed a more complete picture of the field's overall condition. This sharing of information benefited everyone, helping the community as a whole make better decisions about timing and technique. The evening meal at his dwelling brought warmth and nourishment after the day's outdoor work. Godric ate slowly, his thoughts still occupied with the fields and their cycles. His wife moved about their small living space with practiced efficiency, tending to various household tasks while he rested by the fire. After the meal, Godric found himself reflecting on how the three-field system shaped not just the agricultural work, but the entire rhythm of village social life. The communal plowing required cooperation and coordination. The harvest demanded that households assist one another. The decision-making about when to plant and when to plow involved collective discussion. This interdependence created bonds of mutual obligation and support that extended far beyond the merely practical. He thought about his own position within this web of relationships. His family contributed their oxen to the communal plowing efforts. Other households provided additional labor during his harvest. When someone needed extra hands for a particularly demanding task, neighbors appeared to help, knowing that assistance would be reciprocated when their own need arose. This pattern of mutual aid had proven essential to survival through difficult seasons and lean years. The fire burned steadily, its light and warmth creating a cocoon of comfort within the dwelling. Outside, the sounds of evening settled over the village, the closing of doors, the final movements of animals being secured for the night, the gradual quieting as households retired to their rest. Godric remained by the fire longer than usual that night, simply enjoying the peacefulness of the hour. His body had relaxed completely from the day's exertions, his mind settling into that contented state that came from work well done and rest well earned. The patterns of agricultural life surrounded him, the cycle of the fields, the rhythm of the seasons, the web of community relationships that made it all function smoothly. When he finally made his way to the sleeping platform, he carried with him a profound sense of being exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what his life had prepared him for. The three-field rotation was more than a farming technique. It was a way of living in harmony with the land and with each other, a testament to accumulated wisdom and careful stewardship. Sleep embraced him gently, and his dreams were filled with images of fields turning through their eternal cycle, each season flowing into the next, the pattern continuing forward into a future that felt as reliable and stable as the past had been, all of it connected by the simple wisdom of allowing the earth its rest and giving to it the careful attention it deserved. The days continued their progression toward winter, each one bringing subtle changes that marked the season's advance. Godric rose one morning to find frost coating the grass and the edges of puddles, the first real indication that cold weather would soon settle over the countryside in earnest. The sight brought no concern, only a recognition that the year was following its expected pattern, the cycle turning as it always had. He dressed in an additional layer of wool, the extra garment providing necessary warmth against the morning chill. His wife had already rekindled the fire, and the dwelling held a comfortable temperature despite the cold outside. They broke their fast together with warm porridge, the heat of the food as welcome as its nourishment. The walk to the fields revealed a landscape transformed by frost. Every blade of grass, every leaf still clinging to branches, every exposed surface bore a delicate coating of white crystals that sparkled in the early light. Godric's breath formed visible clouds in the air before him as he made his way along the familiar path. The beauty of the morning settled over him like a blessing, a reminder that each season brought its own particular gifts. At the winter rye field, he found the young plants undamaged by the frost. The grain had developed sufficient strength to withstand these early cold snaps and would continue growing through several more weeks before winter's true severity forced it into dormancy. Godric examined the crop with his usual thoroughness, nodding with satisfaction that the plants showed vigorous health despite the changing weather. Other farmers were abroad early that morning as well, all of them checking their crops after the first frost. Brief exchanges of observation passed between them, reassurances that the grain had weathered the cold without harm, comments about how the season was progressing according to normal patterns. These conversations held an understated quality, a recognition that worry served no purpose when dealing with matters governed by forces beyond human control. Godric spent the morning hours attending to various small tasks that had accumulated. He repaired a section of wattle fence that marked the boundary between field and pasture, weaving fresh willow shoots through the existing framework to replace pieces that had weakened over time. The work required patience and attention to detail, qualities that Godric possessed in abundance and applied to every aspect of his agricultural life. The fence repair brought him into contact with several neighbors whose strips adjoined his own family's holdings. They worked companionably, occasionally assisting one another with tasks that benefited from an extra pair of hands. The cooperation flowed naturally, without need for elaborate negotiation or formal arrangement. This was simply how things were done, how they had always been done in the memory of anyone living. By midday, the frost had melted away under the strengthening sun, though the air retained its coolness. Godric paused in his work to eat the bread and cheese his wife had wrapped for him that morning. He settled on a large stone at the field's edge, chewing slowly while his gaze drifted across the landscape that had formed the backdrop of his entire existence. From this vantage point, he could see all three of the great fields that organized the village's agricultural life. The fallow field lay dark and still, resting and gathering strength. The field of winter rye showed its covering of green, the young plants already establishing the root systems that would support their growth through the following year. The stubbled field where barley had grown stood ready for its next planting, the earth prepared and waiting for the winter grain that would soon be sown there. The pattern satisfied something deep within him, a sense of rightness that came from witnessing the proper order of things being maintained. Each field had its role, each season its prescribed activities, and the rotation ensured that this productive pattern could continue indefinitely. The land would never be exhausted as long as they honored its need for periodic rest. After his simple meal, Godric turned his attention to the tool shed where implements were stored between uses. Several items needed repair or maintenance before they would be required again. He spent the afternoon addressing these tasks, his earth-stained hands working with the same careful attention he brought to every aspect of farm work. A hoe needed its blade resharpened, the edge having grown dull through constant use in stony soil. Godric worked the blade against a whetstone, the rhythmic scraping creating a meditative sound that accompanied his thoughts. The motion was familiar, requiring little conscious attention, allowing his mind to drift pleasantly while his hands maintained their steady work. When the hoe's edge had been properly restored, he moved on to examining the wooden handles of various tools, checking for cracks or weaknesses that might cause failure during critical work. Finding one spade handle that had begun to split, he carefully wrapped it with strips of leather, binding the wood to prevent further damage. The repair would extend the tool's useful life for several more seasons, an economy that was both practical and deeply ingrained in the habits of rural life. The sun had traveled well past its highest point when Godric finally set aside his maintenance work. He decided to walk once more through the winter rye, wanting to observe how the plants had responded to their first encounter with frost. The field appeared peaceful in the afternoon light, row upon row of green shoots standing in orderly formation. He moved slowly between the rows, his sun-weathered skin cooled by the breeze that had picked up as the day progressed. The plants showed no signs of stress from the morning's cold. If anything, they seemed to have responded to the temperature change with renewed vigor, as though the frost had awakened something in their growing cycle. This resilience pleased Godric. The winter grains had been cultivated for generations to withstand cold weather, Their very nature adapted to the challenging conditions they would face over the coming months. The selection of seeds, the timing of planting, the preparation of soil, all of these factors contributed to crops that could endure and thrive despite winter's harshness. As evening approached, Godric made his way toward the village center. The community had planned a gathering to finalize arrangements for the upcoming communal plowing of the fallow field. Such meetings happened regularly throughout the agricultural year, marking the major transitions in the work cycle and ensuring that everyone understood their roles in the collective efforts. The gathering took place in the open area near the church, where space allowed the participation of all household heads who contributed to the farming work. Godric arrived to find perhaps 20 men already assembled, their conversation creating a low murmur that spoke of anticipation, mixed with the easy familiarity of neighbors who had known each other their entire lives. The discussion, when it formally began, proceeded with deliberate care. The village headman asked for reports on soil conditions in various parts of the fallow field. Several farmers, Godric among them, offered their observations based on recent inspections. The consensus emerged that the field was ready for its final plowing before winter, the soil having achieved the proper texture and moisture level. Next came the matter of scheduling, which days would be devoted to the work, how the labor would be divided among participating households, how the oxen would be organized into teams. These decisions required balancing many competing needs and considerations, but the community had long practice in reaching agreements that satisfied everyone's requirements. Godric contributed his thoughts when asked, nodding when his family's oxen would be available, and which sections of his strips needed the plow's attention most urgently. His input was received with respectful attention, just as he listened carefully when others spoke. The process embodied the communal nature of their agricultural system. No single voice dominated, but rather a collective wisdom emerged from the contributions of all. By the time the gathering concluded, the arrangements had been settled to everyone's satisfaction. The plowing would begin in 3 days' time, weather permitting, with teams rotating through the field in an organized sequence that would complete the work over the course of a week. Each household understood its obligations and the schedule for fulfilling them. Godric walked home through deepening twilight, the air grown cold enough that his breath formed visible clouds once again. The stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, their distant light providing a sense of constancy and permanence that matched the agricultural rhythms that governed earthly life. His wife had the evening meal ready when he arrived, the dwelling warm and welcoming after the chill outside. They ate together while Godric recounted the details of the meeting, sharing information about the upcoming plowing schedule. His wife listened with interest, understanding how these communal efforts affected the household's planning and resource allocation. After the meal, Godric sat by the fire, allowing its warmth to soak into his muscles. His thoughts returned to the fields and their perpetual cycle. In 3 days, the plowing would begin, marking another milestone in the year's progression. The heavy plow would cut through the fallow earth, turning it one final time before winter's arrival. This work represented the community's collective commitment to maintaining the agricultural system that sustained them all. He reflected on how the three-field rotation had proven itself through countless generations. Other systems existed. Some communities farmed all their land continuously. Some allowed longer fallow periods. Some organized their fields differently. But the three-field system had demonstrated its worth through centuries of reliable harvests. The balance it struck between use and rest, between human need and the earth's capacity, had created sustainable abundance. The fire crackled softly, its flames dancing in patterns that held his attention without requiring thought. Outside, the village had settled into its nightly quiet, the sounds of human activity giving way to the subtler noises of animals and wind. Godric felt his body relaxing completely, the tensions of the day dissolving into a peaceful tiredness. When he finally sought his sleeping platform, he carried with him a sense of anticipation for the coming plowing work. It would be demanding physically, requiring long days of coordinated effort, but it would also bring the satisfaction of communal accomplishment. The field would be properly prepared, the cycle would continue, and another season's growth would be ensured through their collective labor and care. Sleep arrived gently, as natural as nightfall itself, and Godric's dreams were filled with images of freshly turned earth, dark and rich under gray autumn skies, waiting patiently for winter's rest and spring's eventual renewal. The morning of the communal plowing arrived with overcast skies and a steady coolness that promised good working conditions. Godric rose early, knowing that the day would demand sustained physical effort. He ate a substantial breakfast and dressed in his sturdiest clothing, preparing himself for hours spent guiding oxen and managing the heavy wooden plow. At the appointed gathering place near the fallow field, other men were already assembling with their teams of oxen. The animals stood patiently, their breath forming clouds in the morning air, their massive shoulders already fitted with the wooden yokes that would harness their strength to the plow. Godric led his family's 2 oxen into position, speaking to them in the calm, reassuring tones that kept the animals settled and ready for work. The village headman organized the teams, assigning sections of the field to each group in a sequence that would move systematically across the entire fallow area. Godric found himself paired with a neighbor whose strips adjoined his own, a man named Edric who was 53 years old, with calloused hands and graying beard that testified to decades of farm work. They worked well together, having participated in many such communal efforts over the years. Edric guided the oxen while Godric managed the plow, keeping its blade at the proper depth, an angle to turn the soil effectively. The work required constant attention and significant physical strength, but both men possessed the experience and stamina needed for the task. The plow cut through earth that had been prepared over the summer months, its iron-tipped blade slicing deep furrows that exposed darker soil beneath the surface. The oxen leaned into their work with patient strength, responding to Edric's voice commands and the gentle touch of the guiding stick. The team moved forward at a deliberate pace, creating straight furrows that would facilitate spring planting. The rhythmic progress of the plow created a meditative quality to the work. Godric focused on maintaining the proper depth and straightness of each furrow, his earth-stained hands gripping the wooden handles with practiced ease. The resistance of the soil transmitted itself through the implement, providing constant feedback about the ground's condition and texture. He made small adjustments continuously, responding to variations in the earth as they appeared. By mid-morning, the team had completed several long passes across their assigned section. The freshly turned soil showed dark and moist behind them, the furrows lying in neat parallel lines that spoke of skilled work. Godric felt the pleasant warmth of exertion despite the cool air, his muscles engaged in work they had performed countless times before. The oxen maintained their steady pace without complaint, these patient animals as essential to agricultural success as any human effort. Godric appreciated their contribution, understanding that without their massive strength, the heavy plowing necessary for successful farming would be impossible. The community's shared ownership of these work animals represented another aspect of their interdependence, another thread in the web of mutual support that sustained village life. At midday, the teams paused for rest and nourishment. The men gathered in loose groups, sharing bread and ale while the oxen were led to water and allowed to graze on the grass at the field's edge. Conversations flowed easily, touching on observations about the soil, comments about the weather, stories from previous plowing seasons that had become part of the community's shared memory. Godric sat with Edric and several other farmers, eating his simple meal while listening to the talk around him. One man spoke of how his grandfather had helped clear the original forest from these fields generations ago, when the land was first brought under cultivation. Another recalled a particularly difficult plowing season when late rains had made the ground too wet for proper work, forcing them to wait weeks for conditions to improve. These stories served purposes beyond mere entertainment. They transmitted knowledge about dealing with various conditions and challenges. They reinforced the sense of continuity across generations, reminding everyone that they participated in something larger than their individual lives. They strengthened the bonds of community through shared narrative and collective memory. When the rest period ended, the teams returned to their work with renewed energy. The afternoon passed in the same steady rhythm as the morning had done, furrow after furrow being turned, section after section of the fallow field receiving its final preparation before winter. The sky remained overcast, keeping the temperature comfortable for sustained physical labor. Godric found his thoughts drifting as his body maintained its practiced movements. He reflected on how this communal plowing embodied the three-field system's fundamental principles. The work was shared because it benefited everyone. The field being prepared today would produce spring crops that would contribute to the entire community's sustenance. The rotation ensured that this productive capacity would continue year after year, generation after generation. The sun, though hidden behind clouds, had descended considerably when the day's work finally concluded. The teams had completed all the sections designated for that day, leaving the field partially prepared with more work scheduled for the following days. The oxen were unhitched and led away for their evening feed and rest, their day's labor essential and well-earned. Godric walked homeward with the other men, their conversation subdued now with the tiredness that came from sustained physical effort. His sun-weathered skin felt the chill of approaching evening. His muscles held that deep weariness that spoke of meaningful work accomplished. Yet underneath the fatigue lay satisfaction, the good feeling of having contributed to the collective effort that sustained them all. His wife had prepared a substantial evening meal, understanding that the plowing work demanded extra nourishment. Godric ate with appreciation, the food restoring energy depleted through the day's exertions. They spoke little during the meal, comfortable in the quiet companionship that long years together had created. After eating, Godric settled by the hearth, allowing his body to rest completely. The fire's warmth eased the stiffness from his muscles, the flickering light creating shadows that danced across the dwelling's interior. His thoughts returned to the field and the work that remained to be completed over the coming days. The plowing represented more than agricultural necessity. It embodied the community's commitment to maintaining the system that had proven its worth through countless seasons. Each furrow turned, each section prepared, each household's contribution to the collective effort reinforced the bonds that held them together. They depended on one another not just for assistance with heavy tasks, but for the accumulated wisdom about timing and technique that ensured success. Godric reflected on his place within this web of relationships and obligations. His family held their strips of land not as absolute owners, but as stewards entrusted with specific portions of the community's agricultural resources. They contributed their labor and their oxen to communal efforts. They shared in decision-making about timing and methods. They benefited from the collective knowledge and mutual support that made their farming system sustainable. This arrangement had evolved over many generations, shaped by trial and experience into a form that balanced individual household needs with community requirements. The system wasn't perfect. Disagreements occasionally arose. Some years brought better results than others. Challenges emerged that required adaptation. But overall, the three-field rotation and the communal organization that supported it had created stability and sustained prosperity. The fire burned lower as evening deepened into night. Outside, the familiar sounds of the village at rest created their accustomed backdrop, the occasional movement of animals, the distant closing of doors, the gradual quieting as households retired. Godric felt himself relaxing into that peaceful state that preceded sleep, his body grateful for rest after the day's demands. When he finally made his way to the sleeping platform, he carried with him images of freshly turned earth and patient oxen, of furrows lying straight and true, of neighbors working together toward shared purpose. These images accompanied him into sleep, where dreams of continuing cycles and eternal patterns filled his resting mind. The following morning brought similar weather and similar work. Godric rose with the awareness that his muscles would need time to fully adjust to the sustained effort of plowing, but this mild stiffness was familiar and expected. He moved through his morning preparations at his usual unhurried pace, eating breakfast and gathering what he would need for another day in the fields. The teams assembled as they had the previous day, with different sections of the fallow field designated for attention. Godric and Edric continued their partnership, their coordination having been established and proven effective. They moved to their assigned area and began the days plowing with the same steady rhythm that had characterized the previous day's work. The oxen seemed to remember their role from the day before, settling into the work with minimal guidance. The plow cut through earth that varied slightly in texture from yesterday's section, some areas heavier with clay, others more sandy, but all of it responding well to the blade's passage. Godric adjusted his handling to account for these variations, his experience allowing him to make the necessary modifications without conscious thought. As the morning progressed, the sky began to show breaks in the cloud cover. Occasional glimpses of pale blue appeared overhead, and shafts of sunlight broke through to illuminate portions of the landscape in moving patterns. The temperature remained cool but comfortable, ideal conditions for the physical demands of plowing. During the midday rest, Godric found himself in conversation with an older farmer named Wulfric, who was 67 years old, with age-spotted hands and white hair that showed his many decades of life. Wulfric had participated in more plowing seasons than anyone else present, and his observations carried the weight of extensive experience. They spoke of how the soil seemed in particularly good condition this year, responding well to its period of rest. Wulfric noted that he had seen many fallow seasons, and this one ranked among the best in terms of soil recovery. The observation pleased Godric, confirming his own assessment and reinforcing confidence in the upcoming spring plantings. The conversation shifted to memories of previous seasons, stories of challenges overcome and lessons learned through direct experience. Wulfric recalled a year when an unusually wet autumn had forced them to abandon plowing until spring, resulting in a rushed and less thorough preparation that had affected crop yields. He spoke of another season when early frost had damaged winter grain, teaching the community to adjust their planting schedule slightly later. These memories served as living archives of agricultural knowledge, information that couldn't be written down but was preserved through oral tradition and passed from older farmers to younger ones. Godric listened with respect, absorbing insights that might prove valuable in his own future decision-making. The afternoon's work proceeded smoothly, the teams making steady progress across their designated sections. The breaks in the cloud cover increased, and by late afternoon the sky had cleared substantially. The sun, now lower on the horizon, cast long shadows across the partially plowed field, creating a landscape of light and darkness that shifted as the teams moved forward. Godric felt the accumulated tiredness of 2 days' sustained effort, but underneath the fatigue lay deep satisfaction. The work was progressing well, the field receiving proper preparation, the community functioning smoothly in its collective endeavor. These accomplishments mattered more than the physical cost of achieving them. When the day's work concluded, he made his way home through the late afternoon light. The air had grown noticeably colder with the clearing of clouds, and he pulled his woolen cloak more tightly around his shoulders. Above, the first stars were becoming visible in the darkening eastern sky, their appearance marking the transition from day to night that organized all earthly rhythms. The evening meal and fireside rest followed familiar patterns, Godric's body grateful for nourishment and warmth after hours of outdoor labor. His thoughts drifted over the progress made in the field, calculating how much remained to be completed and how many more days of communal effort would be required. The estimates suggested perhaps 4 or 5 additional days, depending on weather and the particular challenges different sections might present. He found himself looking forward to the work's completion, not because he minded the labor, but because finishing represented another successful transition in the agricultural year. The fallow field would be fully prepared, ready to rest through winter and receive spring plantings when the season turned once more. The cycle would continue, as it had always continued, maintained through careful attention and collective effort. Sleep came easily that night, Godric's tired body surrendering quickly to rest. His dreams were filled with images of earth turning beneath the plow's blade, dark soil rolling over to expose fresh surfaces, furrows stretching across fields in patterns as old as agriculture itself. The third day of plowing arrived with clear skies and decidedly colder temperatures. Frost covered everything at dawn, and the air held a sharpness that spoke of winter's approaching dominance. Godric dressed warmly, adding an extra layer beneath his outer garments, preparing himself for work in conditions that would test endurance more than previous days had done. At the field, the teams assembled with visible breath clouds surrounding both humans and animals. The oxen seemed less eager to begin in the cold, requiring more time and gentle encouragement to settle into their yokes. But once the work started, the physical exertion generated warmth that made the temperature bearable. Godric found that his muscles had adjusted to the sustained demands of plowing. The initial stiffness had eased, replaced by a kind of conditioning that made the work feel slightly less demanding than it had on the first day. His hands gripped the plow handles with confidence, his body responding to the implement's movements with practiced efficiency. The cold had hardened the soil slightly, increasing the resistance the plow encountered. This required more effort from both oxen and humans, but the teams adapted to the changed conditions without significant difficulty. The furrows still turned cleanly, the earth still showed proper texture, and the work progressed at a pace only slightly slower than previous days. By midday, the sun had gained enough strength to moderate the temperature somewhat. The frost melted from surfaces, and the air lost its sharp edge though it remained cool. During the rest period, the men gathered more closely together than they had on previous days, sharing body warmth along with conversation and food. Godric ate his bread and cheese while listening to discussion about what the early cold might mean for the winter ahead. Some predicted a harsh season based on the early arrival of frost. Others argued that these early cold snaps often gave way to milder conditions before true winter established itself. The speculation was good-natured rather than anxious. Whatever weather came, they would adapt to it as their ancestors had always done. The afternoon brought continued progress across the field. Section after section received its preparation, the teams working methodically through their assigned areas. The cumulative effect was becoming visible. A substantial portion of the fallow field now showed the dark, freshly turned soil that indicated proper preparation for its next role in the rotation. As the sun descended toward the western horizon, painting the clear sky with subtle shades of amber and pale rose, the teams completed their work for the day. The oxen were unhitched and led away, their steady labor appreciated by all who depended on their strength. Godric walked homeward with muscles that had grown accustomed to the work's demands, his body moving with the easy tiredness that came from productive effort, repeated over days. The evening at his dwelling brought the same comforting routine: warm food, the heart's gentle heat, the companionable presence of his wife moving about their small space. Godric ate with steady appreciation, his appetite sharpened by the day's exertions and the cold air in which he had worked. After the meal, he settled into his customary place by the fire, allowing the day's experiences to settle in his mind. He found himself thinking about the communal nature of the plowing work, how it brought together households that might otherwise interact only occasionally. The shared labor created opportunities for conversation and the exchange of observations that benefited everyone. Young farmers learned from watching experienced ones. Older men gained assistance from the strength of younger bodies. The entire community's agricultural knowledge deepened through these interactions. The fire crackled softly, its flames creating patterns that held his attention without demanding thought. Outside, the temperature was dropping quickly with the clear skies, and Godric was grateful for the dwelling's shelter and the fire's warmth. He reflected on how the seasons turned, how each brought its particular challenges and gifts, how the agricultural calendar organized life around these natural rhythms. When sleep finally claimed him, it came with the gentle inevitability of nightfall itself, bringing dreams of fields resting beneath starlight, waiting patiently for the renewal that spring would eventually bring. The fourth day dawned even colder, with ice forming on the water bucket outside the dwelling and frost coating the interior surfaces near the smoke hole. Godric rose into air that made his breath visible even inside, and he moved quickly to add wood to the banked embers, coaxing them back to flame. The fire's return brought gradual warmth, though the dwelling would not truly become comfortable until the sun had risen higher. After breaking his fast, Godric wrapped himself thoroughly in wool and made his way to the fields. The ground crunched slightly beneath his feet where frost had hardened the surface, and the morning light had a crystalline quality that came only with very cold air. Other men were already gathering, stamping their feet and blowing on their hands while waiting for enough light to begin work safely. The oxen seemed particularly reluctant in the cold, requiring patient encouragement before settling into their yokes. But once the plowing began, the rhythm of work generated warmth that made the temperature bearable. Godric focused on his tasks, keeping the plow blade true, maintaining the proper depth, creating furrows that matched the quality of those turned on previous days. The cold affected the soil differently than warmer conditions had done. The earth turned in chunks rather than crumbling easily, requiring the oxen to pull harder and Godric to manage the plow with more attention to keeping it from catching on frozen clods. The work demanded greater effort, but the teams adapted without complaint, understanding that weather was beyond their control and that the work needed completion regardless of conditions. By midday, clouds had begun moving in from the west, bringing with them the promise of moderating temperatures. The men gathered for their rest period with visible relief, grateful for even slight warming. Conversation turned to how much of the field remained to be completed, with general consensus that perhaps 2 more full days would finish the work if weather cooperated. Godric shared his bread with Edric, the 2 men eating in comfortable silence while watching the clouds thicken overhead. The changing weather patterns held everyone's attention. Too much rain would make the ground too wet for plowing, but moderate precipitation might actually help by softening the frost-hardened soil. They would wait and see what came, adjusting their plans according to conditions as they always did. The afternoon brought gradual warming as the cloud cover thickened. The work became slightly easier with the moderating temperature, and the teams made good progress across their designated sections. Godric felt his body settling into a rhythm that felt almost effortless. His movements synchronized with the plow's motion, and the oxen's pace in a pattern refined through days of repetition. As light began fading toward evening, the first snowflakes appeared, drifting down from the gray sky in lazy spirals. The snow was light, more a suggestion than a substantial fall, but its arrival marked another transition in the season's progression. Winter was announcing its presence, reminding them that the agricultural year was moving toward its period of rest and dormancy. The teams completed their work as the snow continued its gentle descent, then dispersed toward their homes with quiet satisfaction. Godric walked through the falling snow, watching flakes settle on his woolen cloak and melt slowly from his body's warmth. The landscape was transforming around him, familiar features becoming softened and simplified under the accumulating white. At his dwelling, warmth and firelight welcomed him. His wife had prepared a thick pottage rich with barley and root vegetables, the kind of substantial meal that provided deep nourishment after a cold day's labor. They ate while watching snow accumulate on the ground visible through gaps in the walls, the white covering growing slowly but steadily as darkness gathered outside. After the meal, Godric remained by the fire longer than usual, simply watching the flames and listening to the profound quiet that snow brought to the world. The usual evening sounds of the village were muffled, absorbed by the white blanket covering everything. The silence held a quality that invited reflection, a sense of the earth settling into rest after the year's productive efforts. He thought about how the plowing would soon be complete, how the fallow field would lie prepared and waiting through the winter months. The snow now falling would cover the furrows, insulating the soil and providing moisture that would be absorbed when spring thaw came. The field would rest, gather strength, prepare itself for the next phase of the rotation that would bring spring plantings and eventual harvest. This pattern of work and rest, use and recovery, applied not just to the fields but to all of life. The winter months ahead would bring lighter agricultural demands, time for tool repair and maintenance, opportunities for the kinds of indoor work that sustained households through the cold season. The rhythm alternated between intense effort and periods of relative quiet, creating a balance that prevented exhaustion while maintaining productivity. Sleep came peacefully that night, Godric's tired body surrendering to rest while snow continued falling outside. His dreams were filled with images of white fields resting beneath gentle accumulation, the earth gathering itself for renewal, time suspended in the quiet space between seasons. Morning revealed several inches of fresh snow covering the landscape, transforming the familiar countryside into a study in white and shadow. Godric rose to find the temperature had moderated significantly with the snow's arrival, the air no longer holding the sharp cold of previous days. He ate his morning meal while considering whether the plowing work would continue. The snow complicated matters, but didn't necessarily prevent work if the accumulation wasn't too deep. At the gathering place near the field, the village headman consulted with the various farmers about how to proceed. The general sentiment favored continuing while conditions allowed, understanding that delays might bring worse weather that would make completion impossible until spring. The teams assembled with determination, ready to work, despite the added challenge of snow-covered ground. The plowing proved more difficult with snow obscuring the surface, making it harder to maintain straight furrows and judge proper depth. But the teams adapted, moving more slowly and carefully, ensuring that the work maintained acceptable quality despite the challenging conditions. The oxen plodded forward steadily, their massive hooves breaking through the snow to find solid footing beneath. Godric concentrated intensely on his task, using landmarks and previously completed furrows to guide his work. His earth-stained hands gripped the plow handles firmly, making constant small adjustments to keep the implement cutting properly despite the obscured surface. The work demanded complete attention, leaving no room for wandering thoughts. By midday, the snow had stopped falling, though the sky remained overcast and gray. During the rest period, the men gathered more closely than ever, sharing body warmth while eating their simple meals. Conversation was subdued, everyone focused on the work remaining and the weather that might affect their ability to complete it. The afternoon brought continued steady progress. Despite the challenges, the teams maintained their systematic advance across the field. The freshly turned soil showed dark against the white snow, creating stark contrast that made their progress clearly visible. Section by section, the fallow field received its final preparation, the communal effort moving toward completion. As evening approached, the headman called the teams together to assess what remained. After brief discussion, the consensus emerged that one more full day would finish the work, bringing the plowing to completion before any potentially worse weather arrived. This prospect lifted spirits, the end of sustained effort now clearly in sight. Godric walked home through the snow-covered landscape as twilight gathered. His body carried the deep tiredness of multiple days' sustained labor, but underneath the fatigue lay satisfaction in knowing that the work was nearly complete. One more day of effort, and the fallow field would be fully prepared for its winter rest and eventual spring planting. The evening meal brought welcome warmth and nourishment. Godric ate with quiet appreciation, his thoughts already turning toward the final day of plowing. After eating, he settled by the fire, allowing his muscles to relax completely. His sun-weathered skin felt the heat's comfort, and he closed his eyes briefly, simply experiencing the sensation of rest after demanding work. His wife moved about their dwelling, attending to various small tasks while he rested. Her presence brought comfort beyond the practical assistance she provided, the companionship of shared life, the mutual support that sustained households through all seasons and conditions. Godric felt grateful for this partnership, for the way their lives had woven together over the years into a single fabric. When he finally sought his sleeping platform, he carried with him anticipation for the following day. The completion of the plowing would mark an important milestone in the agricultural year, a transition point between active work and winter rest. The three-field rotation would continue its eternal pattern, maintained through the collective effort and accumulated wisdom of the community. Sleep embraced him gently, bringing dreams of finished work and fields resting peacefully beneath snow, waiting patiently for time's wheel to turn once more toward spring and renewal. The final day of communal plowing arrived with clearing skies and moderating temperatures. Godric rose with a sense of purpose, knowing that this day's work would complete the preparation that had occupied the community for nearly a week. He dressed warmly and ate a substantial breakfast, preparing himself for one last sustained effort. At the field, the teams assembled with quiet determination. The remaining sections were clearly visible, and everyone understood exactly what needed completion. The work began with practiced efficiency, each team moving to its assigned area and beginning the steady rhythm of plowing that had become so familiar over the previous days. The snow had compressed and partially melted, making the work slightly easier than the previous day had been. The oxen moved forward with patient strength, and the plow cut through earth that responded well despite the cold conditions. Godric fell into the meditative state that repetitive skilled work always brought him, his body performing its tasks, while his mind drifted in peaceful observation. The morning passed steadily, furrow after furrow being turned, the remaining unplowed sections growing smaller with each pass. By midday, the end was clearly approaching, and the men worked with renewed energy, knowing that completion was within reach. The rest period that day was brief, everyone eager to finish the task that had occupied them for so long. The final section was completed in mid-afternoon, the last furrow turned with a sense of collective accomplishment. The teams gathered at the field's edge, looking back over the expanse of prepared earth that represented their shared labor. The fallow field now lay ready for winter, properly prepared for its role in the ongoing rotation that sustained their agricultural life. The satisfaction of completion settled over the gathered men like a blessing. They stood together in loose groups, their breath forming clouds in the cold air, surveying the work that had occupied them for nearly a week. The field stretched before them, its surface showing the dark earth of countless furrows, all lying ready for winter's transformative rest. The village headman spoke briefly, thanking everyone for their contributions and noting how well the work had proceeded despite the challenging weather. His words were simple and heartfelt, acknowledging the collective effort that made such accomplishments possible. The men nodded in quiet agreement, their satisfaction requiring no elaborate expression. The oxen were unhitched for the final time this season, led away to well-earned rest and extra feed. These patient animals had provided the essential strength that made heavy plowing possible, and their care was considered as important as any other aspect of agricultural work. Godric led his family's 2 oxen toward their shelter, speaking to them in gentle tones that conveyed appreciation for their steady labor. As he walked homeward afterward, Godric felt the pleasant tiredness that came from sustained work brought to successful completion. His muscles held that deep weariness he had grown accustomed to over the past days, but now it was accompanied by the knowledge that no more plowing awaited him tomorrow. The transition from intensive communal labor back to the quieter rhythms of winter work brought its own kind of relief. The landscape around him showed signs of the season's progression. Snow still covered much of the ground, though it had melted in patches where the sun's angle provided more direct warmth. The bare branches of trees stood stark against the gray sky, their summer covering long since fallen and returned to earth. The air held the particular quality of late autumn moving into early winter, cool but not yet bitterly cold, transitional and expectant. At his dwelling, his wife greeted him with warm ale and the news that she had prepared a special evening meal to mark the plowing's completion. The gesture touched Godric. These small acknowledgments of significant milestones created markers in the passage of time, moments that stood out from the general flow of daily routine. The meal proved as substantial as promised, with pottage enriched by precious herbs carefully preserved from the harvest season. They ate slowly, savoring both the food and the sense of accomplishment that the day brought. Conversation flowed easily between them, Godric recounting details of the final day's work, while his wife shared observations about the village and the activities of neighbors. After eating, Godric settled by the hearth with a sense of complete relaxation. The fire burned brightly, its warmth spreading through the dwelling's interior and creating a circle of comfort against the cold evening outside. He stretched his legs toward the flames, feeling the heat penetrate his woolen leggings and warm his tired muscles. His thoughts drifted over the week's work and what it represented within the larger pattern of the three-field rotation. The fallow field now lay prepared, ready to rest through winter and receive spring plantings when the season turned. The winter rye continued its growth in the second field, the young plants establishing the root systems that would support next year's grain production. The third field, already harvested of its barley, waited for its own planting of winter grain, which would happen in the coming weeks if weather permitted. This rotation embodied accumulated wisdom about how to maintain soil fertility while maximizing productive capacity. By allowing each field to rest for 1 year out of every 3, they prevented the earth from becoming exhausted. By alternating between spring-planted and winter-planted crops, they distributed the intensive labor of planting and harvest across different seasons. The system balanced human needs with the land's capacity in a way that had proven sustainable across countless generations. Godric reflected on his place within this long tradition. His work continued patterns established by ancestors whose names he no longer knew, whose lives had been lived in these same fields under these same skis. The knowledge he possessed had been accumulated grain by grain across centuries, each generation adding small refinements while maintaining the essential framework that ensured success. This sense of continuity brought deep comfort. He was not alone in his efforts, but rather part of an unbroken chain of human labor and care, extending backward into the distant past and forward into the unknown future. The fields he tended had been tended by others before him, and would be tended by others after him. the pattern continuing as long as people needed sustenance from the earth. The fire had burned lower while he sat lost in these reflections. His wife had completed her evening tasks and now sat near him, working on some mending by the firelight. The domestic scene held profound peace, two people sharing space and life, their individual efforts contributing to household survival and comfort, their companionship enriching the experience of existence. When Godric finally sought his rest that night, he carried with him a sense of completion that went beyond the mere finishing of plowing work. The milestone marked the successful continuation of patterns that had sustained his people through uncounted seasons. The rotation would proceed. The fields would rest and produce in their appointed times, and the community would be nourished by the fruits of their collective labor and wisdom. Sleep came with unusual swiftness, his tired body surrendering immediately to rest. His dreams were peaceful and untroubled, filled with images of fields resting beneath winter skis, the earth gathering strength for the renewal that would come with spring's eventual return. The following days brought a shift in the rhythm of Godric's activities. Without the intensive communal plowing to occupy his time, he returned to the smaller tasks that filled the quieter periods of the agricultural calendar. These activities were no less important than the dramatic work of plowing or harvesting, but they proceeded at a gentler pace and required different kinds of attention. One morning, he devoted several hours to repairing tools that had seen heavy use during the recent plowing. Several wooden handles needed attention, their surfaces worn smooth by constant gripping and use. Godric worked carefully, using a knife to shave away rough spots and splinters, creating surfaces that would sit comfortably in the hand during future work. The task required patience and attention to detail rather than physical strength. He sat near his dwelling in pale sunlight that provided little warmth but adequate illumination for close work. His earth-stained hands moved with practiced skill, the knife removing precise amounts of wood to achieve the desired smoothness. The repetitive motion brought its own meditation, allowing his thoughts to drift while his hands continued their skilled work. A neighbor passed by and paused to observe Godric's work. They exchanged greetings and brief observations about the weather, which remained cold but had brought no additional snow since the plowing's completion. The neighbor mentioned that he planned to begin preparing leather for the winter months ahead, work that would occupy indoor hours when outdoor tasks became impossible. After the neighbor departed, Godric continued his tool maintenance, moving from handles to checking metal blades for damage or excessive wear. Finding one hoe blade that had developed a crack, he set it aside for the village smith to examine. The implement might be repairable or might need replacement, a decision requiring specialized knowledge that Godric did not possess. By midday, the tool work was complete. Godric put away his implements carefully, storing them in the protected area where they would remain dry and accessible. He then turned his attention to inspecting the family's small supply of stored grain, checking that it remained free from moisture and pests that could damage their winter provisions. The grain had been stored in large ceramic vessels sealed with clay stoppers, a method that had proven effective at protecting the contents from spoilage. Godric opened each vessel in turn, examining the grain's appearance and smell, verifying that it remained in good condition. The inspection satisfied him. The storage was working as intended, and their food supply appeared secure for the months ahead. The afternoon found him walking once more to the fields, wanting to observe how they appeared now that the intensive work had concluded. The winter rye showed continued healthy growth, the young plants having responded well to recent cold weather. The fallow field lay quiet beneath its covering of turned earth and patches of snow, resting as it was meant to do. Godric moved slowly between the fields, his observations unhurried and thorough. He noted where drainage channels might need attention when conditions allowed further work. He examined boundaries between strips, checking that markers remained clear and undisturbed. He looked for any signs of problems that might require addressing before harsher winter weather made outdoor work more difficult. The landscape held a beauty particular to this transitional season. The bare trees and dormant fields created a simplified palette of browns and grays and whites, the visual complexity of summer growth reduced to essential forms. The sky stretched vast and pale overhead, its clouds moving slowly across the expanse in patterns that spoke of weather systems developing far away. As evening approached, Godric made his way back to the village center. Several other men had gathered there, taking advantage of daylight's last hours to exchange information and observations. The conversation touched on various topics: repairs needed to the communal granary, plans for winter wood gathering, news about families expecting births in the coming months. Godric listened more than he spoke, valuing the information that emerged from these informal gatherings. The village functioned through such exchanges, decisions being made collectively through gradual consensus rather than imposed authority. Each household's needs and concerns received consideration, and solutions emerged that balanced individual requirements with community welfare. When full darkness had settled, Godric walked home through cold air that carried the scent of wood smoke from many hearths. The familiar smells and sounds of evening in the village surrounded him, the movements of animals being secured for the night, voices calling final good nights between dwellings, the creak of doors closing against the cold. His wife had the evening meal ready, and they ate together in the firelight's warm glow. The food provided nourishment and comfort, simple fare that nonetheless satisfied completely. After eating, Godric remained by the hearth, his body relaxed, and his mind settled into the peaceful contemplation that evening hours always brought. He found himself thinking about the coming winter months and how they fit into the larger pattern of the agricultural year. Winter represented a necessary period of rest, not just for the fields but for the farmers themselves. The intensive work of spring planting, summer maintenance, autumn harvest, and field preparation had concluded. The months ahead would bring lighter demands, indoor work, time for tool repair and planning. This rhythm of intense effort alternating with quieter periods created sustainability, not just for the land, but for the people who worked it. Without the winter rest, the repeated cycles of demanding labor would eventually exhaust even the strongest bodies. The agricultural calendar built in this necessary recovery time, allowing humans and earth alike to restore themselves before the cycle began again. The fire crackled softly, its flames creating dancing patterns that held his attention without requiring focused thought. Outside, the temperature had dropped with nightfall, and frost would surely form before morning. But inside the dwelling, warmth and shelter created a protected space, a small circle of comfort within the larger cycles of season and weather. When Godric finally sought his sleeping platform, he carried with him a deep sense of rightness about the patterns that organized his life. The three-field rotation, the communal labor, the alternation between intense work and rest, all of it fit together into a coherent whole that had proven its worth across generations. He was part of something larger than himself, connected backward to ancestors and forward to descendants through the eternal cycle of planting and harvest, use and rest, human effort and Earth's generous response. Sleep arrived with gentle inevitability, bringing dreams of fields passing through their seasons, the pattern turning like a great wheel, each phase giving way to the next in endless, reassuring repetition. The days that followed settled into the gentler rhythms characteristic of early winter. Godric rose each morning to find frost coating the world outside his dwelling, the crystals forming intricate patterns on every exposed surface. The sun, when it appeared, traced a low arc across the southern sky, its light pale and slanting, providing illumination without substantial warmth. One morning, he decided to walk the boundaries of his family's scattered strips, wanting to verify that the markers remained clear and that no encroachment had occurred. This inspection was part of the regular maintenance that prevented disputes and ensured each household's holdings remained properly defined. The work required no tools, only careful observation and knowledge of where boundaries lay. He began at the fallow field, locating the stone marker that indicated where his family's first strip began. The stone had been placed generations ago, worn smooth by weather and time, its presence as permanent as anything human effort created. Godric traced the boundary with his eyes, following the line that separated his family's responsibility from the neighboring strip. The walking brought him across ground he knew intimately, every rise and depression familiar from years of working this soil. He noted where water tended to collect during heavy rains, where the earth was particularly fertile, where stones occasionally worked their way to the surface and needed removal. This detailed knowledge came only from sustained attention across many seasons, accumulated gradually through countless hours spent in these fields. Other farmers were similarly occupied, moving slowly across the landscape on their own errands of inspection and maintenance. Occasional greetings were exchanged when paths crossed, brief acknowledgments that required no extended conversation. Each man understood what the others were doing, the shared patterns of agricultural life creating mutual comprehension without need for elaborate explanation. By midday, Godric had completed his inspection of the fallow field strips. All markers remained secure, all boundaries clear, nothing requiring immediate attention or adjustment. He moved on to the field where winter rye grew, wanting to observe once more how the young grain was progressing through its early growth period. The rye appeared healthy and vigorous, showing no signs of damage from the cold weather that had settled over the countryside. The plants had achieved sufficient size to withstand the winter months ahead, their roots extending deep into soil that would protect them from frost's worst effects. Godric felt satisfaction in this observation, another confirmation that the season was proceeding according to normal patterns. He knelt beside one row, examining several plants more closely. The leaves showed good color, deep green without any yellowing or browning that might indicate stress or disease. The spacing between plants appeared optimal, neither too crowded nor too sparse. The soil around the roots felt properly moist, holding enough water without being waterlogged. These detailed observations formed part of the constant monitoring that successful farming required. Problems caught early could often be addressed before they became serious. Patterns noticed in one season informed decisions in future years. The accumulation of such small observation across many seasons built the practical knowledge that distinguished experienced farmers from novices. The afternoon brought Godric to the third field, where barley stubble still stood in neat rows awaiting the winter grain planting that would happen in the coming weeks. This field would complete the rotation, receiving its winter crop before the season advanced too far. The timing required judgment. Plant too early, and the grain might grow too much before winter's arrival. Plant too late, and it might not establish sufficient roots before the ground froze. These decisions were never made individually, but rather emerged from communal discussion and consensus. The village elders, men like Wulfric with their decades of experience, provided guidance based on whether observations and knowledge of past seasons. Younger farmers contributed fresh observations and energy. Together, the community arrived at a timing that balanced various factors and concerns. Godric walked slowly across the stubbled field, his thoughts occupied with the planting decision ahead. The weather had been colder than average for this time of year, which might argue for earlier planting to ensure adequate establishment before deeper cold arrived. But the soil held good moisture, which might support later planting. The considerations balanced delicately, requiring careful weighing of multiple factors. As the sun descended toward the western horizon, painting the sky with subtle gradations of gray and pale gold, Godric turned his steps homeward. The air had grown noticeably colder with the sun's decline, and he pulled his woolen cloak more tightly around his shoulders. The landscape around him held the stark beauty of early winter, simplified forms, muted colors, the essential structures of the land revealed without summer's elaborate covering. At his dwelling, warmth and firelight welcomed him. His wife had been occupied with her own work during the day, spinning wool into thread that would eventually be woven into cloth for the household's needs. The wooden spindle and distaff rested near the hearth, evidence of hours spent in this necessary labor. The pile of finished thread had grown noticeably, testament to her steady productivity. They shared the evening meal while discussing the day's activities. Godric described his boundary inspection and his observations about the winter rye. His wife spoke of progress with the spinning, and mentioned that a neighbor had stopped by earlier with news that another family was preparing for winter slaughter of a pig, with portions to be shared among several households according to long-established arrangements. These exchanges of information kept them connected to the village's larger life. Though their dwelling stood somewhat apart from the main cluster of buildings, they remained woven into the community through countless threads of mutual obligation, shared knowledge, and reciprocal assistance. The isolation was physical rather than social, a matter of where their particular dwelling happened to be located rather than any separation from communal bonds. After the meal, Godric sat by the fire, allowing the day's walking to settle from his muscles. His sun-weathered skin felt the pleasant contrast between the heat at his front and the cooler air at his back, a sensation that always accompanied sitting near a hearth in cold weather. His thoughts drifted over the fields and their rotation, the pattern that had organized his entire life. He reflected on how the three-field system created a kind of security through its very predictability. Each year brought the same rotation, fallow to spring planting to winter grain and back to fallow. This pattern meant that even in difficult years when one crop failed, others might still produce. The diversity of plantings spread risk, ensuring that complete failure was unlikely even when conditions proved challenging. The system also created fairness in the distribution of both good and poor land. Because each household held strips scattered across all three fields, everyone received portions of the better and worse soil. No family monopolized the most fertile areas, and no family was stuck permanently with only the poorest ground. This distribution emerged from generations of adjustments and had achieved a balance that most found acceptable. The fire burned with steady warmth, its light creating shadows that shifted and danced across the dwelling's interior. Outside, the sounds of the village settling into night formed their familiar backdrop, the final movements of animals, the closing of doors, the gradual quieting as households retired to rest. These sounds marked the day's conclusion as reliably as bells marked the hours of prayer. Godric found his thoughts turning toward the upcoming planting of winter grain in the third field. The work would not require the intensive communal effort that plowing had demanded, but it would still involve coordination among households and careful timing to achieve success. The seeds would need to be distributed, furrows prepared in the already plowed ground, soil tamped down properly after sowing. These tasks would unfold over several days, each household working its own strips while remaining aware of neighbors' progress and ready to offer assistance if needed. The work would proceed at a measured pace, without the urgency that sometimes characterized spring planting when narrow windows of favorable weather required quick action. When Godric finally sought his sleeping platform that night, he carried with him images of fields in their various states, the fallow earth resting dark and rich, the winter rye growing steadily in ordered rows, the stubbled field awaiting its planting. These images formed the backdrop of his existence, the landscape of both waking life and sleeping dreams. Sleep arrived gently, bringing with it visions of the cycle continuing, season following season, the pattern maintained through careful attention and collective wisdom. In his dreams, he saw spring arriving with its burst of growth, summer bringing maturation and warmth, autumn offering harvest and preparation, winter providing necessary rest. The wheel turned endlessly, and he turned with it, his life woven into the eternal rhythm of planting and harvest, use and recovery, human effort and Earth's generous response. The morning that marked the beginning of winter grain planting arrived with clear skies and moderate temperatures. Godric rose early, knowing that the next several days would bring focused work that required consistent attention. He ate a substantial breakfast and gathered the seeds that would be sown in his family's strips, grain carefully selected from the previous year's harvest, the best specimens set aside specifically for planting purposes. The seeds rested in a woven basket, their weight substantial enough that Godric felt the burden as he carried them toward the fields. Each grain represented potential, the promise of growth and eventual harvest, the continuation of the cycle that sustained life. The responsibility of planting carried significance beyond the merely practical, connecting him to the ancient partnership between humans and earth. At the field, other farmers were already beginning their work. Unlike the communal plowing, this planting proceeded with each household managing its own strips independently. The work required less coordination, but still benefited from the presence of neighbors. Assistance could be offered when needed. Observations could be shared. Companionship made the labor feel less isolated. Godric began by marking rows across his strip, using a wooden implement to create shallow furrows in the already plowed earth. The spacing needed to be consistent, providing each plant adequate room without wasting space that could produce additional grain. His movements fell into practiced rhythm, the marker creating neat lines that would guide his seed distribution. When the furrows were complete, he began the actual sowing, walking slowly along each row and distributing seeds with careful attention to spacing and depth. Too many seeds in one spot would create crowding and competition. Too few would waste the prepared earth's productive capacity. The proper distribution required judgment developed across many seasons of planting experience. His earth-stained hands moved rhythmically, reaching into the basket, withdrawing a measured amount of seed, scattering it along the furrow with a motion that ensured even distribution. The work proceeded at a pace that balanced efficiency with thoroughness, never rushing but never dawdling, maintaining steady forward progress through the rows. The morning advanced with Godric absorbed in his planting work. The physical activity generated warmth despite the cool air, and he found himself settling into that meditative state that repetitive skilled labor always produced. His body performed its tasks while his mind drifted in peaceful observation, noting the quality of the soil, the clarity of the air, the distant movements of birds across the pale sky. By midday, he had completed perhaps half of his strip's planting. He paused for rest and nourishment, settling at the field's edge with bread and cheese. Other farmers had similarly paused, and several gathered near where Godric sat. Their conversation touched on the planting's progress, observations about soil conditions, hopes for the winter grain's eventual success. One man mentioned that his elderly father had said this felt like a winter that would bring adequate snow, enough to insulate the ground and provide moisture, but not so much as to create problems. The observation prompted general agreement, though all understood that weather predictions were uncertain at best. They would adapt to whatever winter actually brought, as they always had. The afternoon brought continued planting work, Godric resuming his steady progress along the remaining furrows. The sun had emerged more fully, providing gentle warmth that made the labor pleasant rather than taxing. His hands continued their rhythmic motion, reaching into the basket, withdrawing seeds, scattering them with practiced evenness along each prepared row. As he worked, Godric found himself reflecting on the nature of this particular task. Planting held a quality different from other agricultural work. It was inherently hopeful, an act of faith in the future. Each seed placed in earth represented belief that seasons would turn, that rain and sun would come in proper measure, that the soil would provide what growing plants needed. The work embodied trust in patterns larger than individual human control. By late afternoon, the planting of his strips was complete. Godric stood at the field's edge, surveying the rows of newly sown grain. The seeds lay invisible beneath the soil's surface, already beginning the mysterious process of germination that would eventually produce green shoots, and many months hence, golden grain ready for harvest. The sight brought quiet satisfaction, another phase of the rotation successfully completed. Other farmers were similarly finishing their planting work, and several paused to exchange observations before departing for their homes. The general sentiment reflected contentment with the day's progress and optimism about the winter grain's prospects. Weather conditions had cooperated, soil had been in good condition, and the work had proceeded smoothly without unexpected difficulties. Godric walked homeward as the sun descended toward the horizon, the empty basket considerably lighter than it had been that morning. The seeds he had carried to the field now rested on earth, beginning their transformation from dormant potential into living plants. This transformation never ceased to hold wonder for him, despite having witnessed it countless times across the years of his farming life. At his dwelling, his wife greeted him with warm ale and news that a neighbor had brought by fresh bread, a gesture of friendship and mutual support typical of village relationships. They shared the bread with their evening meal, its flavor enhanced by the simple pleasure of food, received as a gift rather than obligation. Such exchanges strengthened bonds between households, creating networks of goodwill that provided security beyond material resources. After eating, Godric settled by the hearth with a sense of completion. The major agricultural tasks for this season had concluded. The harvest brought in, the fallow field plowed, the winter grain planted. The weeks ahead would bring lighter demands, maintenance work and preparation for winter's deeper cold, but no intensive communal efforts until spring planting arrived many months hence. His thoughts drifted over the rotation and how each phase connected to all others. The fallow field resting now would receive spring plantings in a few months. The winter rye currently growing would be harvested next summer. The grain just planted would mature and be harvested the following year. The pattern extended forward in time, each field moving through its appointed cycle, the whole system functioning as an integrated unity. He reflected on his own life within this framework. He had been born into a farming household, had learned agricultural work from childhood, had inherited responsibility for his family's strips when his father could no longer manage them. Eventually, he would pass this responsibility to the next generation, just as it had been passed to him. The continuity extended across generations, individual lives brief compared to the endless turning of seasons and cycles. The fire crackled softly, its warmth radiating into the dwelling's interior. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. Frost would form again during the night, coating everything with delicate crystals that would sparkle in tomorrow's morning light. The pattern of cold nights and cool days would continue through the coming weeks, gradually intensifying as winter established its full presence. Godric found comfort in these predictable rhythms. The seasons turned according to patterns that transcended individual human concerns. Weather arrived in its appointed time, neither early nor late by any cosmic measure. The earth rested and produced according to its nature, responding to care and attention, but ultimately governed by forces beyond complete human control. When he sought his rest that night, sleep came with the ease that accompanied physical tiredness and mental peace. His dreams were filled with images of seeds germinating in dark earth, tiny roots pushing downward, pale shoots reaching toward light that would eventually guide them to the surface. The cycle continued even in sleep, the pattern of growth and dormancy, effort and rest, playing out in the theater of his resting mind. The following days brought a shift in weather, with clouds gathering and a steady light rain beginning to fall. The precipitation was welcome. It would provide moisture to the newly planted seeds, helping them establish the initial growth needed before winter's cold forced dormancy. Godric watched the rain from the shelter of his dwelling, nodding its gentle persistence, feeling grateful for timing that seemed almost providentially appropriate. With outdoor work limited by the wet conditions, he turned his attention to indoor tasks that had been waiting for such weather. The leather straps on several tools needed replacement, their surfaces worn thin by repeated use and exposure to weather. Godric settled near the hearth with strips of new leather and the tools requiring repair, working carefully to create fastenings that would prove durable and reliable. The work required patience and attention to detail. Each strap needed proper length and secure attachment, factors that would affect the tool's usefulness during future work. Godric measured carefully, cut precisely, attached securely, taking satisfaction in work done thoroughly even though its results would be visible only to himself. His wife worked nearby at her spinning, the wooden spindle rotating steadily as thread accumulated around its shaft. The domestic scene held profound peace, two people occupied with productive work, the fire providing warmth and light, rain falling steadily outside while they remained dry and comfortable within their dwelling's shelter. They spoke occasionally, brief exchanges that required no elaborate conversation. After many years together, they had developed an easy companionship that valued silence as much as speech, finding comfort in shared presence rather than constant verbal interaction. The quiet felt restful rather than empty, a quality that made their dwelling a place of genuine refuge. The rain continued through that day and into the next, a steady, gentle precipitation that soaked into the earth without causing flooding or erosion. Godric checked the drainage channels near his dwelling, verifying that water was flowing properly away from the structure rather than pooling where it might cause problems. Finding everything functioning as intended, he returned inside to continue his tool maintenance work. By the third day, the rain had diminished to occasional drizzle, and patches of clearing appeared in the western sky. Godric ventured out to inspect the newly planted field, wanting to observe how the soil had responded to the moisture. The earth appeared properly saturated without being waterlogged, ideal conditions for seed germination and early root development. Other farmers had similar intentions, and several were already moving slowly across their strips when Godric arrived. Brief exchanges confirmed that everyone's assessment matched his own. The rain had provided exactly what was needed, and conditions now favored the winter grains establishment. Such fortunate timing couldn't be controlled or predicted, only appreciated when it occurred. The afternoon brought fuller clearing, with the sun emerging to illuminate a landscape transformed by rain. Colors appeared richer, surfaces gleamed with moisture, the air smelled of wet earth, and the complex scents released when water interacted with soil and vegetation. Godric walked slowly through the village, observing these changes, noting how the rain had affected various features of the familiar landscape. At the common area where villagers often gathered, several men had assembled to discuss plans for the coming weeks. Winter wood gathering needed organization, determining which sections of the forest could be used, how the work would be divided, how the wood would be distributed among households. These decisions required the same collective consideration that agricultural matters received, ensuring fairness and maintaining the community resources that everyone depended upon. Godric participated in the discussion, offering his thoughts while listening carefully to others' perspectives. The conversation proceeded without hurry, each person's input receiving respectful attention. Gradually, consensus emerged about timing and methods, creating a plan that accommodated various households' needs while protecting the forest from overharvesting. When the gathering concluded, Godric walked home through the late afternoon light. The air had grown colder with the clearing, and he could see his breath forming clouds before him. Winter was asserting itself more fully, moving beyond the transitional period into the season's established presence. The fields would soon lie dormant beneath snow, the grain plants resting in their first winter, waiting for spring's eventual arrival to resume their growth. At his dwelling, the evening meal brought warmth and nourishment. His wife had prepared pottage enriched with the last of their stored autumn vegetables, creating a dish that provided both sustenance and comfort. They ate together while firelight created dancing shadows on the walls, the simple domestic scene embodying the patterns that sustained life through all seasons. After eating, Godric remained by the fire, his thoughts occupied with the weeks ahead. Winter would bring its own rhythms, wood gathering for fuel, tool maintenance and repair, indoor work on various household projects. The intensive agricultural labor had concluded for the season, allowing time for these other necessary activities. The alternation between different types of work prevented monotony while ensuring that all essential tasks received proper attention. He reflected on how the three-field rotation shaped not just agricultural practices, but the entire texture of life. The system created a framework that organized time, structured relationships, distributed resources, and connected individual effort to collective welfare. It represented accumulated wisdom refined across countless generations, a solution to the fundamental challenge of sustaining human communities through productive partnership with the land. The fire had burned low while he sat in contemplation. His wife had finished her evening tasks and now prepared for sleep. Godric rose and added wood to the fire, ensuring it would maintain warmth through the cold night ahead. The familiar actions carried comfort in their very ordinariness, simple tasks repeated endlessly across the years of his life. When he finally sought his sleeping platform, he carried with him a deep sense of contentment. The agricultural year had turned through another complete cycle. Fields had been planted, tended, harvested, and prepared for the next season's growth. The rotation continued its eternal pattern, maintained through careful attention and collective wisdom. His life was woven into this pattern, part of something larger and more enduring than individual existence. Sleep embraced him gently, bringing dreams of fields resting beneath winter skies, seeds dormant in dark earth, the cycle suspended in that quiet space between seasons. In his dreams, he saw spring approaching in the distant future, the land awakening once more, green shoots emerging from soil, the pattern beginning again as it had always begun, as it would always begin, the wheel turning through its appointed course, eternal and reassuring in its constancy. The days that followed brought a deepening winter. Snow fell several times, light accumulations that covered the landscape in white and transformed the familiar countryside into a simplified study of essential forms. The fields lay quiet beneath their frozen covering, the grain plants dormant, the fallow earth resting, all of it waiting patiently for time's wheel to turn once more toward spring and renewal. Godric's days settled into winter's particular rhythms. Morning chores involved tending animals, ensuring they had adequate feed and water despite the cold. Wood needed constant gathering and carrying, maintaining the supply that kept the dwelling warm through long winter nights. Tool maintenance continued, each implement receiving attention that would ensure its readiness when spring work resumed. The winter months brought their own gifts alongside their challenges. The lighter workload allowed time for contemplation and rest that summer's intensive demands made impossible. Neighbors visited more frequently, the shortened days and limited outdoor work creating opportunities for social connection. Stories were shared, knowledge passed along, the bonds of community strengthened through these interactions that the busy seasons often prevented. One afternoon, old Wulfric visited Godric's dwelling, seeking companionship and conversation on a particularly cold day. The two men sat by the fire, talking of seasons past and seasons to come, sharing observations accumulated across their combined decades of farming experience. Wulfric spoke of patterns he had noticed across his long life, how certain weather conditions in autumn often predicted particular winter characteristics, how soil responded differently to various treatments, how the rotation could be adjusted slightly to account for unusual circumstances. Godric listened with deep respect, understanding that he sat in the presence of irreplaceable knowledge. When Wulfric eventually passed from this life, decades of accumulated wisdom would pass with him, unless it was shared and preserved through such conversations. The thought brought a quiet urgency to his attention, a recognition that these exchanges held value beyond the immediate pleasure of companionship. As winter deepened, Godric found himself returning often to the fields, walking among them even when no work required his presence. The landscape held a stark beauty in its dormant state, the simplified forms revealing essential structures usually obscured by summer's elaborate growth. He walked slowly between the sleeping fields, observing how snow accumulated differently in various locations, how wind shaped the white covering into subtle sculptures, how the land waited in patient stillness. These walks brought deep peace to his spirit. The dormant fields embodied rest in its purest form, not absence or emptiness, but rather a gathering of strength, a restoration of capacity, preparation for renewal. The earth was not dead but sleeping, holding within itself the potential for spring's explosive growth. The pattern of use and rest, effort and recovery, played out on the largest scale, visible in the very landscape that sustained human life. The three-field rotation had created this rhythm, this balance between production and restoration. By allowing each field to rest regularly, the system ensured that the land's capacity would never be exhausted, that generation after generation could rely on the soil's continued fertility. The wisdom embodied in this pattern reflected a deep understanding of how to maintain sustainable abundance, not through constant extraction, but through respectful partnership, giving as well as taking, honoring the earth's needs alongside human requirements. As Godric stood in the winter fields, 41 years old with earth-stained hands and sun-weathered skin, surrounded by the sleeping land that had sustained his ancestors and would sustain his descendants, he felt himself connected to something vast and enduring. The cycle would continue turning, seasons following seasons, the pattern maintained through countless small acts of care and attention. His life was part of this eternal rhythm, woven into the fabric of agricultural existence that stretched backward into the distant past and forward into the unknown future. The wind moved across the white fields, stirring loose snow into swirling patterns that caught the afternoon light. Godric watched these movements, finding beauty in their temporary forms, seeing in them a reflection of life itself, constantly changing yet following recognizable patterns, individual yet part of larger wholes, brief yet connected to something eternal. The fields rested around him, gathering strength for the renewal that would come when winter finally released its grip and spring returned to wake the sleeping earth once more. The winter continued its slow progression, each day bringing subtle shifts in light and temperature that marked time's passage. Godric maintained his routines, tending animals, gathering wood, checking that dwelling and outbuildings remained secure against the weather. These tasks provided structure to days that might otherwise blur together in winter's long stillness. One morning, he woke to find that snow had fallen heavily during the night, accumulating to a depth that came nearly to his knees when he stepped outside. The world had been transformed into an expanse of unmarked white, every familiar feature softened and simplified beneath the covering. The silence held an almost tangible quality, sound itself seeming muffled by the thick blanket that had settled over everything. He set about clearing a path from the dwelling to the animal shelter, his wooden shovel pushing through snow that was light and dry, easy to move despite its substantial depth. The physical work warmed him quickly, and he settled into the steady rhythm of clearing. Lift, throw, step forward, repeat. The simple repetition brought its own meditation, his mind settling into peaceful observation while his body continued its practiced movements. By the time paths had been cleared and animals tended, the sun had risen higher, illuminating the snow-covered landscape with light that seemed to emanate from the white surface itself, as much as from the sky above. Godric paused in his work to simply observe the beauty surrounding him. The way individual flakes caught light and sparkled, the smooth curves of snow drifts shaped by overnight wind, the dark tracery of bare tree branches standing in stark contrast against the white. The village appeared transformed by the heavy snowfall. Smoke rose from numerous hearths, gray columns ascending straight into the still air. Occasional movement marked where other villagers emerged to tend to necessary tasks, dark figures crossing white expanses in slow progress. The sounds of shoveling and animal care carried clearly through the cold air, creating an acoustic landscape that felt intimate despite the distances involved. Godric decided to check on the fields, wanting to see how they appeared beneath their heavy covering. The walk took longer than usual, his feet breaking through the snow's surface with each step, but he moved at an unhurried pace, enjoying the crisp air and the unusual perspective that the deep snow provided. At the winter rye field, the grain plants were completely hidden beneath the white blanket. The snow would provide excellent insulation, protecting the dormant plants from the worst of winter's cold. When spring eventually arrived and the snow melted, the moisture would soak into the soil, providing exactly what the resuming plants would need for vigorous growth. The heavy snowfall, which might have seemed burdensome to human activity, represented a blessing for the agricultural cycle. The fallow field lay pristine and unmarked, its covering of snow revealing nothing of the turned earth beneath. This field rested most completely of all, no growing plants to protect, no seeds awaiting germination, just soil gathering strength in profound stillness. The sight brought Godric a sense of deep rightness, an appreciation for how the rotation honored the land's need for periodic complete rest. The third field, where winter grain had been planted, similarly lay hidden beneath snow. The seeds that had been sown weeks earlier now rested in darkness beneath layers of frozen earth and white covering. They would remain there through the remaining winter weeks, dormant but alive, waiting for conditions that would trigger the next phase of their growth cycle. Godric stood at the boundary where the three fields met, able to see portions of each from this vantage point. The rotation was visible even beneath winter's covering three great sections of land, each in its particular phase of the eternal cycle. The pattern held such elegant simplicity. Use, rest, use in different forms, return to rest, repeat endlessly. Yet within that simplicity lay the accumulated wisdom of generations, knowledge refined across centuries into a system that worked in harmony with the land's natural capacity. The cold eventually prompted him to return homeward, his cheeks and nose tingling from exposure to the winter air. At his dwelling, warmth and shelter welcomed him, the contrast making the interior feel especially comfortable after time spent in the cold. His wife had kept the fire burning steadily, and the dwelling held a temperature that allowed comfort without excessive fuel consumption. The afternoon passed in indoor work. Godric continued his tool maintenance while his wife worked at her spinning, the two of them sharing space in companionable quietness. Occasionally, one would speak, sharing an observation or memory, but lengthy conversation felt unnecessary. The comfort lay in shared presence, in the domestic peace that came from working together toward household welfare. As evening approached, Godric found his thoughts returning to the snow-covered fields and what they represented. The heavy accumulation provided perfect conditions for the dormant grain, yet it also reminded him of how human plans remained subject to forces beyond control. They could prepare soil carefully, plant at appropriate times, tend crops with diligent attention, but ultimately, weather would play a decisive role in determining results. This recognition brought neither anxiety nor resignation, but rather a kind of humble acceptance. The three-field rotation worked with natural patterns rather than trying to overcome them. By allowing fields to rest, by rotating crops, by working collectively rather than individually, the system created resilience that could absorb variations in weather and conditions. Some years brought better harvests than others, but the overall pattern remained sustainable across time. The fire crackled softly, its light pushing back the darkness that had gathered outside. Through small gaps in the dwelling's walls, Godric could see that snow had begun falling again, light flakes drifting down through the still air. The world was receiving another layer of insulation, another contribution to the moisture that would eventually feed spring growth. He reflected on how his life had been shaped by the agricultural patterns that surrounded him. The field's rotation had determined the rhythm of his years: spring planting, summer tending, autumn harvest, winter rest and preparation. His relationships had been formed through shared agricultural labor. His understanding of time itself was organized around the seasonal cycles that governed farming work. This integration of human life with agricultural necessity was so complete that he rarely thought about it consciously. It simply was the way things were, the framework within which existence unfolded. Only in quiet moments like this, sitting by the fire while snow fell outside, did he step back mentally and recognize how thoroughly his life was woven into the pattern of the land and its cycles. When he finally sought his rest that night, the dwelling had grown quite cold despite the fire's steady warmth. He and his wife burrowed beneath wool blankets on the sleeping platform, their combined warmth creating a pocket of comfort. Outside, snow continued falling through the darkness, adding to the deep covering that protected the sleeping fields and dormant seeds. Godric's last waking thoughts were of the grain plants resting beneath layers of snow and frozen earth, alive but dormant, waiting with infinite patience for the conditions that would allow their growth to resume. His own rest felt connected to theirs, a gathering of strength during winter's long pause, preparation for renewal when the cycle turned once more toward spring. Sleep came gently, bringing dreams of white fields under starlight, of seeds holding life within themselves through long, cold darkness, of the eventual thaw that would release water into soil and warmth into air, waking everything to grow once more. The pattern continued even in sleep, the cycle turning in his dreaming mind as it turned in the world beyond his dwelling's walls. The weeks that followed brought the deepest cold of winter. Temperatures plunged until water left outside overnight froze solid, until breath crystallized instantly upon meeting the air, until even the protected interior of dwellings required constant fire to maintain bearable warmth. Godric's daily routines adapted to these conditions: shorter periods outside, more time devoted to ensuring adequate firewood, extra attention to keeping animals warm and fed. Yet even in winter's harshest period, life continued its patterns. The sun traced its low arc across the southern sky each day, providing light if not warmth. The stars wheeled overhead each night in their ancient patterns, connecting this winter to all winters that had come before. The village maintained its rhythms of survival and community, households supporting one another through the season's challenges. One particularly cold afternoon, Godric sat by the fire working on a small wood-carving project. The work required no urgent completion, but provided productive occupation for hands that could not comfortably work outside in the bitter cold. He shaped a simple wooden bowl, his knife removing thin curls of wood with each careful stroke, the form emerging gradually from the rough block he had started with. The repetitive motion brought the same meditative quality that agricultural work always did, a peaceful state where time seemed to slow and thoughts drifted without urgency. His earth-stained hands moved with practiced sureness, the knife following paths determined by the wood's grain and his accumulated experience. The work would eventually produce a useful household object, but the value lay as much in the process as in the result. His wife sat nearby, mending a woolen garment that had developed tears from use. Her hands moved with equal skill through work she had performed countless times, needle and thread creating repairs that would extend the garment's useful life through another season. Their parallel activities created a scene of domestic industry and partnership, two people working together toward household welfare. As the afternoon progressed, a neighbor stopped by, a younger farmer named Osric, who was 26 years old, with work-roughened hands and dark hair. He had come seeking Godric's advice about preparing for spring planting, wanting to draw on the experience that came with additional years of farming. Godric welcomed him warmly, gesturing him toward the fire's warmth and offering ale. Their conversation ranged across various topics related to agricultural work. Osric asked about timing decisions for different crops, about how to judge soil readiness, about techniques for managing the heavy plow during communal work. Godric responded thoughtfully, sharing not just specific answers but the reasoning behind various approaches, helping the younger man develop the judgment that experience would eventually refine. The exchange reminded Godric of similar conversations he had had with older farmers when he was Osric's age, seeking wisdom from those whose accumulated knowledge could help him avoid mistakes and understand subtleties. The passing of agricultural knowledge from generation to generation happened largely through such informal exchanges, wisdom transmitted through conversation and observation rather than formal instruction. When Osric eventually departed, Godric returned to his woodcarving with renewed appreciation for his place in the long chain of agricultural tradition. He had received knowledge from those who came before, was currently applying it in his own farming practice, and was now beginning to pass it along to those who would follow. The continuity provided a kind of immortality. His individual life was brief, but the knowledge and patterns he participated in would continue long after he was gone. The fire burned steadily as evening approached, its warmth holding back the bitter cold that gripped the world beyond the dwelling's walls. Outside, the snow-covered fields lay frozen and still, the dormant grain plants waiting with infinite patience beneath their protective covering. The rotation continued even in winter's depth, rest preparing for eventual use, dormancy gathering strength for eventual growth, the pattern suspended but not ended. Godric's thoughts drifted over the seasons ahead, mentally reviewing what would come when winter finally released its grip. The winter rye would resume growth as soon as warming allowed, racing toward maturity through spring and early summer. The fallow field would receive its spring plantings, likely oats or barley, when soil conditions permitted. The most recently planted winter grain would establish its growth pattern, though harvest lay far in the future. Each field would move forward in its appointed cycle, the rotation continuing its eternal pattern. These future activities felt distant on this cold winter day, yet they provided a kind of anchor, a reminder that winter's stillness was temporary. The land was not abandoned but merely resting, gathering itself for the intense productivity that warmer seasons would bring. Human activity would resume its intensive pace when conditions allowed, but for now, rest was appropriate for fields and farmers alike. When darkness had fully settled and the evening meal had been consumed, Godric and his wife prepared for sleep. The fire was banked carefully, positioned to burn slowly through the night and provide warmth without requiring constant tending. Extra blankets were piled on the sleeping platform, creating insulation against the cold that would intensify as the night progressed. Godric settled into rest with his usual sense of peaceful completion. Another day had passed, winter's slow progression continuing, the cycle maintaining its course despite the apparent stillness. Beneath frozen earth and deep snow, life persisted, grain plants holding themselves ready for spring, seeds awaiting the conditions that would trigger growth, the land itself resting but alive, patient but not passive. Sleep arrived with the gentle inevitability that comes with physical tiredness and mental peace. In his dreams, Godric saw the fields as they would be when spring finally returned. Green shoots emerging through thawing earth, plows turning soil awakened from winter sleep, the entire landscape stirring back to life and activity. The vision brought comfort even in dream, a reminder that the cycle would continue, that winter's stillness would give way to spring's vitality, that the pattern maintained itself through time's endless turning, eternal and reliable as the seasons themselves, the rotation continuing forever in its appointed course. The winter days continued their slow passage, each one bringing Godric back to the essential rhythms that had sustained his people across generations. The fields rested beneath their covering of snow, gathering strength in stillness, while the village maintained its quiet patterns of survival and community. In the evenings, Godric sat by the hearth with his wife, the fire's warmth creating a circle of comfort against the cold darkness beyond their walls. His thoughts often drifted to the fields and their eternal rotation, the fallow earth resting in complete stillness, the winter rye holding life within dormant plants, the recently sown grain waiting patiently beneath frozen soil for for conditions that would allow growth to begin. The three-field system had organized his entire existence, providing not just sustenance but meaning, connecting his individual efforts to something larger and more enduring than a single life. The pattern would continue long after he was gone, maintained through the same careful attention and collective wisdom that had sustained it for countless generations before him. As Godric prepared for sleep each night, he carried with him images of the snow-covered fields resting peacefully under winter stars. The land was not idle but gathering itself, storing moisture and fertility, preparing for the renewal that would come with spring's eventual return. The cycle continued even in winter's depth, suspended but unbroken, the eternal pattern of use and rest, effort and recovery, human partnership with the generous earth that sustained all life. Outside, snow fell softly through the darkness, each flake adding to the protective covering that insulated the sleeping fields. Inside, warmth and shelter surrounded Godric as he settled into rest, his breathing gradually slowing, his muscles releasing the day's small tensions, his mind drifting into the peaceful space between waking and sleep, where dreams of turning seasons and eternal cycles waited to accompany him through the quiet hours of the winter night.